Let's get into our big stories now, and we start on the tangent of the economy. We're going to be talking finance matters. Just a quick breakdown. In recent times, across different platforms across the world, the perspective has been Ghana, how expensive things have become, and where our economy is headed. We've been likened to the likes of Sri Lanka, Argentina, and other countries that are in some dire economic straits. So, a quick breakdown. 391 billion. That is our debt stock. And that accounts for some 78% of our GDP. When you look at our local debt, internal debt, it stands at around 38% of our budget projection. So, where do we go from here in the midst of all of this, in the midst of inflation, which is still ongoing? Joining us for the conversation, we have former Minister for Finance and Economic Planning, Seth Tekpe. He joins the conversation. We'll also have other economists joining the conversation as we map the way forward for Ghana right from here in our studios. Mr. Tekpe, a very good morning to you. Thank you for joining the conversation.
Yeah, good morning and good morning to your viewers and to your listeners.
Okie doke. That is if it's even morning where you find yourself. But let's start from where we find ourselves. I recall sometime in January, February, thereabouts, Isaac Adonko, the deputy ranking member on the Finance Committee of Parliament, alleged that Ghana was a debt-distressed economy. He cited the IMF on that. There was a lot of talk about that and even a rejection of that. At the time, we were also pegged against the likes of Sri Lanka. Here we are again, and we're in a situation that some say is not tenable. We've heard from the likes of Professor Gachi, among others. But when you look at our current financial position, vis-a-vis our debt to GDP ratio, which the IMF projects will hit as high as 85+% by 2025 before it starts receding. And when you look again at the Bank of Ghana and the measures they've been putting in place, what is your reading? Are we doing the right things to stabilize our economy?
Yeah, thank you very much. Clearly, we wouldn't be doing the right things if given where we are now. So there must definitely be something wrong. And let me also mention that the risk of debt distress did not start with this year.
Right.
It has been, almost 2 years. And for us, the wake-up call came with the IMF Article 4 in 2019. When some of us were drawing attention, where the IMF had made adjustments to the methodology we were using for calculating the arrears and debt in particular, which showed a fiscal gap, of 3 to 5%, lower than what, higher than what we had been saying. Our deficit was, our arrears and others were. It boils down to basically to bailout costs. When that adjustment was made, in fact, that Article 4 was published in November 2019, at the very time that we were reading the 2020 budget. We did not pay heed, we did not adjust, the budget that was under discussion. And then came 2020 and COVID. And we attempted, to blame everything on COVID. If you recall, there was that, intense debate. Despite the significant resources we got for COVID, between 5 to 6 billion US dollars. We're not talking Ghana cedis, which even at 6 Ghana cedis to the dollar at the time, you're talking about 30 billion or so. We find ourselves where we are. Let me also state that we are a country we should not be in this dire situation, considering that right from 2017, in fact, you can go back to the Kufuor era, His Excellency President Kufuor's era, and the onset of oil, and the thinking that began, around using oil to try and resolve our problems. You know that we attempted to put the PRMA in place, that's the Petroleum Revenue Management Act, and we succeeded to some extent. We can come back to all those, sinking fund and others. By 2017, we had built buffers, stabilization fund, sinking fund, infrastructure fund, and we were making, let's say, even modest, progress. So if with that sort of background and debt was at about 57%, of GDP, right? And then we had 3 oil fields. And even with the difficulties of COVID, then that wasn't our only crisis. We are where we are today. Then I think there is a serious, rethink that has to take place. And this rethink is something which has been, actually reduced to whether we should go to the IMF or not. That's not the issue. The point some of us have made is that where the government is exercising the prerogative not to go to the IMF, what is the alternative? That is the question. Let's take it as given. So if you put yourself, if you take the background and the fact that we are a country that has been, to HIPIC, which itself was as distressing as comparing ourselves to Argentina. And Argentina is a strong economy. It got misaligned. And the issue with Argentina is that it has had debt, dogging it, since, the 1990s. That is the issue. Sri Lanka has difficulties. So that is where we do not want to be. I think if we know the features that we are talking of these countries, and some of these countries were once upon a time strong economies. That's where we don't want to be. Let me pause at this point with one additional point. Look, we are a country that is also in the markets as we speak. And when I say markets, I mean the global financial markets. We've been borrowing since our first sovereign bond. And this was, and the debt was rising. We are a country that declared HIPIC, as I said. And so the mechanisms that were put in place to try and manage debt, such as a sinking fund, refinancing, but backed with repayment of the debt which we put aside, placed us in a very bad position with the markets a long time ago, because with our B ratings at the time, which admittedly, with the difficulties that we had, global financial crisis and the rest, we were down to B minus. But considering that today we are in the C class, our debts to be sustainable in terms of market access, right, should be around, at the most 60-65%. So you can see the gap in terms of performance where we should be to be viable in terms of borrowing.
Right.
We should be B plus. And B plus means that there are several criteria, but one of the significant criteria is that as a B plus country, your debt should be around 60-65. Ideally, if you want to push towards, what you call investment grade, then your debt should be, somewhere between 50, and 55. So we are talking about a 20-25% on difference between where Ghana ought to be. We should look inward. We should not be, we should start looking inward.
Okay.
To find the solutions and not wait for the IMF and others to tell us this story. We are in dire straits, so let me pause at this stage.
Right. We are in dire straits. The Bank of Ghana has initiated certain moves. We'll be walking through some of those to find out whether those are the appropriate remedial measures we need, because some have said this is a misdiagnosis of the problem. But let me go to Professor Godfred Bokpin, lecturer at the University of Ghana Business School. I just want you to do this for us. I'm sure a lot of people are listening and wondering, what is all this talk about? Debt distress. What is debt distress? And when you look at our economic profile, what do you see to be our exposure, our risk to debt distress as of now? Because there have been so many things that have been put out, and some say we're really getting to unsustainable levels. Others say it is not that bad. What do you see, Professor Bokpin?
Yes, thank you very much. Good morning to your cherished listeners, and then good morning to Honorable etc. I associate largely with a lot of the comments he has made, the input he has made. So you can look at debt sustainability across different indicators, and of course, different frameworks as well. Um, the one we usually talk about, debt to GDP ratio, of course, it's not favorable. There's nothing in there that suggests that we are in the safety zone.
Where the safety zone would be what? Because we're pegged at around 78% now.
Yes, so your debt level is safe to the extent that current measures, together with the additional measures that government announced recently, if you do the projections, you do not expect that your debt to GDP ratio would increase steadily in the medium to the long term. But that said, debt to GDP ratio isn't a comprehensive measure of your debt sustainability. It's a more conservative measure. Essentially, what it is telling you is that how hard will it be if you decide to pay off all your national debt with 1 year's national income or output. But really, there's no requirement that you should pay off all your debt with 1 year's income. No, because in the standard finance literature, you borrow against future cash flows. There are some debts that were taken for 15 years, 20 years, 5 years, and stuff like that. And the other limitation with that is that it only considers the country's debt repayment capacity with only just GDP output. It doesn't consider the wealth of the nation out of which the output is generated. And again, there are other considerations that are not factored in. And that is why you realize that for purposes of ascertaining your debt distress, the risk of debt distress, which is a challenge in terms of you being able to service your debt obligations, both in terms of the interest and the principal, or how difficult that will be for you, and the sacrifice that you have to make in order to respond to just your debt dynamics. So you will then look at other forward-looking measures like debt service to revenue ratio. So if you, with an increased GDP as we saw from the revised data from 2021, you realize that the debt to GDP ratio came down from 81% that we were talking about to about 76.6%, thereabout. But that does not improve your liquidity indicators like debt service to revenue ratio, because if that expansion in GDP does not necessarily lead to higher tax collection in terms of your tax effort, then it doesn't help you that much. So if you look at our debt service to revenue ratio, it's that bad. Okay, it's that bad. So what that is doing to all of us is that because of the fiscal space that is taken by debt servicing alone, it leaves the country with practically nothing to embark on growth-enhancing spending, because the government also needs to spend prudently to stimulate economic growth. That is taken out. Then if you add compensation of employees, it makes it worse. Then that is not the only indicator. You're also looking at your export performance, because when we talk about debt sustainability, usually the focus is on the external debt. Because the external debt, once your generation capacity is denominated in cedis, your servicing obligation is denominated in foreign currency, then your ability to earn more foreign exchange is fundamental to your debt sustainability. So from there, we also look at present value of debt to export ratio and stuff like that. But when it comes to the internal debt, the domestic component, typically default remains mute to some extent, because once they are denominated in cedis, in the worst scenario, Bank of Ghana will print more cedis to pay down on that debt.
Right.
When they do so, the excess injection of liquidity into the economy will create inflationary pressures. And that jump in inflation represent effectively a form of taxation on your income, right? So you look at that dimension also. So if you put all these things together in terms of the present value of debt to GDP ratio and all of that, you realize that we are in an unfavorable situation in terms of the
You speak.
prudential limit or the threshold.
You speak of thresholds, you speak of the distressing situation in which we find ourselves. You say it is not the best place to be.
No, it is not.
Right.
And you know what makes it worse?
Tell me.
What makes it worse is that because government said it wasn't going to go for the IMF, maybe because of political pride or whatever, the domestic measures that have been announced do not clearly outline a fiscal sustainability path out of this current situation, right? And government itself isn't communicating appropriately to the market. When it happens that way, deeper meaning will be read into the situation, and the city may take another haircut, right? So there isn't any regular update. In fact, government announced coupon, whatever, rebate, this. But what is the update? What is the level of progress from that level and all of that? So that is a bit worrying, right? That is a bit worrying.
Look, I just wanted to add to the mix, throw into the stew that we're actually putting together. There's also the bit to do with the fiscal deficit, which is also worsening. Now, our projections for the first quarter, 2.3 billion. When you look at the data that we've got from the Finance Ministry and others, it's pointing to 2.6 billion. That's an increment of some 0.3%.
Yes.
What does that mean, throwing that into the mix?
It makes it worse. So you see, when you talk about in addition to what I said, your debt sustainability variables revolve around principally three items. The primary fiscal balance, which you just talked about, interest rate, and then economic growth, real GDP growth. So if the projection is that GDP growth is going to pick up, and as we saw towards for 2021, higher than what was reported earlier, you've checked that box. But the other two variables are against us. Interest rates are heading up. That again doesn't help your debt sustainability dynamic. Your fiscal balance is also deteriorating. It doesn't help your debt sustainability dynamics. And that is why we are saying that it doesn't look like we are getting out of this anytime soon under the current measures that the government has announced. Okay, that is where the issue is. Now, what it also means is that because you are constrained from all of this, practically you cannot look to any policy initiative right now backed by appropriate spending to stimulate growth that will take us out of this in a more inclusive, sustainable manner. You don't see that. You don't see that currently, and that is a bit concerning.
Let me pose an interesting question to Seth Tekwe. Let me go back to Mr. Tekwe. If you were, again, I like to do this because it's practical, you would notice that some of those watching our live feed are saying, look, in your time, what did you do differently? So let me throw it to you, Mr. Tekwe. What would you have done differently faced with all of these odds? So your monetary policy, you've had to hike on the back of the exchange rate, especially against the dollar. There has been some measured stability in that regard. But then again, there continues to be an uptick in the debt to GDP profile. You're also facing other things. You're facing inflation, which is over 23%, in fact, 23.6%. Then you are looking at a worsening of your deficit by another 0.3% in the first quarter. It appears that would be a tricky situation. What would be your go-to remedial measure in such an instance?
Well, thank you very much. In order not to sound like one is pontificating, and one is also saying that we did not face our own challenges, let me be very specific, and I mentioned one of them. Look, the problem we have had is that we borrow. We pay only the interest, and then we defer the principal. That is, we defer the loan itself. We don't have a mechanism for repayment. We said to ourselves, let us stop that habit. So right in the Constitution, there's something called a sinking fund, which we had not established since the 1992 Constitution. So we established it. We put part of the oil revenue into the sinking fund. What did we achieve? To be specific, within 3 years of setting up the sinking fund, we were able to put 550 million US dollars aside, to pay off the first sovereign bond, to give a signal to the markets that when we borrow, we have a plan, for repayment. That is what the sinking fund achieved. And let me also state that 200 million of that amount was used by the current government to finish paying His Excellency President Kufuor's first sovereign bond in 2017, October 4th, on maturity. Remember, that bond was for 10 years. Second, you will recall that when we had COVID, right, one of the funds we relied on first was the stabilization fund, which is also part of the oil revenue. It's oil revenue that we put aside, right? In fact, it was a buildup of that stabilization fund, which we capped to also use to set up the sinking fund, right? You recall that we immediately went to Parliament, withdrew 250 million US dollars from the stabilization fund to support the budget in terms of COVID. At our time, when we established the fund and we had the crisis in 2015, 2016, in terms of oil revenues, we were able to take out only 15 million, the equivalent of 50 million US dollars. So compare 15 million to 250 million. In fact, as we speak today, we are close to withdrawing 400 million from the stabilization fund. And yet we have not, with 3 oil fields, that was done with 1 oil field, we have not restored, or removed the cap so that we can build up the fund for the next crisis, right? As I said, out of the bonds that we did, we had our problems, but we put 250 million US dollars, and part of oil revenue as seed capital, for the Ghana Infrastructure Investment Fund to tackle commercial projects, our self-financing, projects, right? So these are some of the initiatives, very specific, practical, verifiable, which we started putting, in place, to change the way in which we did things. So those who are asking the questions, I'm giving these examples, and we can have, a program, on some of these issues. Look, the situation in which we are talking about, what is the sustainability? Let's reduce it to the household. You have borrowed. Maybe you had a crisis, you had difficulties. You had crisis, you had difficulties. Either the child is sick, or even on a regular basis, because your income is low, and many Ghanaians do that. You go to your bank, you get money to pay school fees and the rest, and you see the debt, going up. Your salary, is low. You know very well that you have to make provision. And then you continue borrowing, and you are maintaining a lifestyle, no longer necessity, on loans. That is where we are, right? So again, to beg the question, in order not to look pontificating again, what did we do? We faced a similar situation when crude oil prices fell in 2015, 2016. And we suspended expenditure. We were going to build 200 SHS schools, critical at the time, very political. Remember, free SHS. We said we were going to do 120 instead of 200 because the revenue was not flowing, because crude oil prices, which we used to build the sinking fund, the stabilization fund, and the other things, which not to mention the heritage fund, because that oil revenue was drying up, and it had gone down, we said the flagship going into that election in 2016, we would complete only 50 to 60 of those schools in order to prepare, for the progressively fee-free, education. Where are we today? Have we cut any expenditure? As Professor Bogwin, mentioned a short while ago, every government, since Dr. Buchi's era, the essence of saying that you are doing an IMF program, there is an ownership element in it. And it consists of the fact that you are not generating enough revenue, and therefore you must cut expenditure. Have we, in sincerity, cut expenditure? We announced that we're going to reduce expenditure, discretionary expenditure. Yes, discretionary because you cannot cut the statutory ones. You cannot cut, interest, which we are using to service the let alone. We are borrowing. Now, is it sustainable? I don't know where we want to get to. Particularly you mentioned that some are saying that it's not too bad. Let us face it, the situation is bad. And I think we should stop gratifying ourselves or ingratiating ourselves to think that, part of the situation may not be as dire. It is, and that is because, as Professor Bobbin hinted, when you take your total revenue, you are using it to pay virtually two items, compensation and the interest. You are not talking about the borrowing, because you are borrowing to pay the past loan, the borrowing that you did in the past. It's paying virtually these two items. It is what is the outcome? We are no longer building infrastructure. What is the outcome? We are no longer, tackling, recurrent expenditures. You should, as your introduction, the present situation, and others, we know them. Even the wages, we are still negotiating with labor. And we put in the PRMA that the wages should be negotiated before April. Have we negotiated the 2023 wage bill? We are still talking about 2021, 2022 promises. By the end of April, we should have completed negotiating the 2023, again, as a result of the lessons that we learned. So I think we should just face up to the fact that the situation is bad, and we should not be exaggerating ourselves, by thinking that, we could do something about it, given the current trajectory. We need to tackle expenditure. We need to tackle the flagship expenditures, which, yes, politically are often very difficult to tackle.
Politically are often very difficult to tackle. It's good that you admit that. I'll be coming back to you on that point, but let me also bring in Professor John Gachi into the conversation. Prof, a very good morning to you, sir. Hello, Professor Gachi. It's a pleasure having you, of course. He is with the UCC Business School. I just want to put this to you right off the bat. So by the year 2000, we're facing economic constraints. After that, the Kufuor administration decided we had to go HIPC, heavily indebted poor country. We joined that ignominious community, so to speak. But then we had the benefits, because some $4 billion was written off our debt profile. In fact, as of 2006, by the time when we were weaning ourselves of the HIPC arrangement, we were looking at a debt profile of just around $750 to $780 million, 25% of GDP. 25%. Fast forward to today, we have increased that profile by about 7,000%. Our debt to GDP is 78%. And we're looking at about $54 billion. When, in fact, the average profile for growing or developing economies or developing countries is at 60%. So looking at where we are, almost 20 percentage points away from what in the developing world you would expect. Is it as bad as some people paint it? And if not, what is the difference?
Thank you. I think it's very bad, and not necessarily because of the debt to GDP ratio, but because the accompanying financial indicators that should anchor debt to GDP ratio, whether it is high or low, have not been very robust. So, for example, if you compute your debt to GDP ratio, you say conservatively is 78%. Are you willing to talk about your export revenue to GDP, export to foreign component of the debt payment? Are you willing to talk about your tax, the repayment of the interest as a ratio of tax revenue, etc.? And when you compute that, you see that the situation is precarious. And that is what I believe we should be looking at. Now, what do you contract or procure debt for? Normally, debt should be procured for long-term development of the country. What is the strategic direction in terms of infrastructure, public investment, or within the framework of the debt that we have accumulated? These are the issues that I believe we should be dealing with. So it is not the case that people are just talking about debt to GDP ratio, but the accompanying financial measures that should give some respite to people and the economy are not good. That is why normally we will want to use countries like Japan, even the US. Why is it that their debt to GDP ratio is very high, but they are more comfortable than we are? It is because of the other measures which we have not been talking about, which are critical to define whether we are.
Let's take a quick look at some of those measures, because in recent times, there's also been talk about the fact that the central bank, for example, and the finance setup is misdiagnosing the problem. So let's look at some of those other feed-in, plug-in measures that we've not looked at so far.
I indicated that already. Look at our budget, whether those other measures that I talk about have been amplified. The finance minister is comfortable talking about debt to GDP. And recently, when our economy in the first quarter shows some robust performance, you saw that the finance minister quickly issued a press release just to indicate that now the debt to GDP ratio has reduced from around 78% to 76% before it went back again. Well, what does that mean? It means that the finance minister is overly relying on debt to GDP ratio. And debt to GDP ratio, even when it reduces, it does not reduce your commitment in terms of amortization. It does not reduce your commitment in terms of interest payment necessarily. So the challenge is there. How much revenue are you mobilizing in order to anchor the level of expenditure you incur? Those are the issues that you need to be talking about. What program do you put in place? What infrastructure engagement do you have that will contribute from three levels, contributing to the level of employment in terms of maybe it may not necessarily be engagement for permanent sake, but when those infrastructure are put in place, they will provide sound jobs, and at the same time, that will be a new revenue conduit to contribute to revenue generation, etc. What are the new opportunities that are spread across? Those are issues that we need to be focusing on about the economy. So for me, overly relying on the debt to GDP ratio to determine whether your economy is doing well or not, it's not happiness over time. And you mentioned our engagement with IMF, World Bank in terms of HIPIC. As you rightly say, HIPIC came with some benefits. Where we are now, and even if you look at the HIPIC period, after we exited, we were glorifying ourselves that we have raised the largest bond in Sub-Saharan Africa, which means our appetite for debt is in our gene. So as to whether we use it appropriately or not, I'm happy you have the former finance minister online. The appropriate way of trying to reduce the future risk of your debt is to accompany the debt with sinking fund, and you commit yourself to the sinking fund. If sinking fund were not to be put in place along the line to amortize the 750 million in April 2017, that would have been another burden for us. So if you are running an economy which is becoming bufferless, you need to be worried. That is what we are doing right now. So you need to run an economy that is surrounded with buffers so that when situations like this come, you are able to fall on some and then you defray the effect. But that is not what we are having currently.
Very quickly on this, the Bank of Ghana, in trying to resolve the situation, the governor has been alarmed at our debt related, how we've been accruing debt, basically. But he's been talking about reprofiling and restructuring. In this sense, reprofiling and restructuring our debt, what are the opportunities open to Ghana as of now?
We have done reprofiling for some time now. But what we need to look at critically is that if continuously and consistently your real growth is less than your real cost of borrowing, then reprofiling is not the answer. And that is the situation we find ourselves, and we need to work on that. Why are we comparing debt to GDP? Because we believe there is something within GDP that will protect the economy. So if you are growing at the rates which is far, far lower, sometimes 2-3 times lower than the cost of borrowing, you need to be aware that something may happen along the line. That is why you need to prioritize. That is why you need to do efficient disbursement of those borrowing. That is why those borrowing should be directed to real things that will contribute to the economy. When we are discussing what our debt have been used for, the first time we had an attempt to deal with that was when we realized that the situation was even more precarious. We were told that we use our debt for banking sector cleanup. We were told that we use our debt for COVID-19, and we realized that we spent only 8.1 billion on COVID-19. And if we look at all the monies we got to address COVID-19, that is even more than the 8.1 billion. So we need to pay attention to quality disbursement of our borrowing, and that will give us comfort. But if that is not possible within the regime, I do not think that we are poised to live within a comfortable zone when it comes to managing our debt.
Let me come back to Professor Bokpin before I swing into Seth Tekpe. Prof, so looking at all of these dynamics and the picture that Professor Gachi paints, you add to the fact that when it comes to borrowing, there is external borrowing and domestic borrowing, internal borrowing. But even internally, it appears we are on the ropes, because then again, you look at the difference between January and March. We've accumulated some 8 billion, 181.9 billion to 189.9 billion. When you look at the difference, about 8 billion accrued within the sector, which represents 38% of our projected, figures for the year. What does that really mean, throwing that into this conversation?
I think from the 2022 budget, given the wide disparity between total revenue and total expenditure, we knew that government was going to do a lot of borrowing. And given the fact that, as Honorable Secretary said, that our market access is challenged, ability to access capital from the international capital market is challenged, government will look to the domestic market.
Right. Just a quick one. Pardon the interjection. You said that it was expected on the back of these factors that government was going to do a lot of borrowing. But did you expect this much borrowing? Yeah,
I am not surprised. But you see, one key revenue measure of the government, which was the e-levy, of course, we oppose it, and we still oppose it, was supposed to have kicked in from February. The delay with the passage and all of that certainly would affect the first quarter numbers. But now that we've been able to force it down our throats, probably we'll see how the second quarter and the rest will look like. But if anybody told you that we are not going to borrow or we're going to slow down anytime soon, that is certainly not supported by the reality on the ground right now. Because, and if you remember, Honorable Secretary was saying that the huge interest payments on our in our budget right now is just the interest component. The principal is done through rollover and a whole lot of other things. So we will still do a lot of, but that's why I said earlier that if you look at the measures contained in the 2022 budget and then the additional measures that were announced, you are unable to clearly establish a fiscal sustainability path from these current measures. And government will have to do a lot more if their posture is that they don't want to do an IMF program. There has to be a credible alternative timeline with some reporting line, with some kind of transparency and disclosure that gives confidence to the market. We need to have that. That must be on the table. As it stands now, that clarity is not there, and that is where I am concerned.
Mm. You throw into the mix the fact that we're also missing our revenue targets. As per reports today, we're falling short by some 13.6%. You look at the gap in there, about 3 billion plus in the first quarter of the year, from Get Fund to everything else. Of course, now we have the e-levy tagging along. What can we do in this regard? And what would be the ramifications if, what we are expecting, our revenue targets are also not met? What would be the ramification on eventually, by close of year, our debt profile and our financial positioning as a country?
Hello?
Yes, Professor Bokwin, did you get the question?
No, the line was breaking. Sorry.
Right.
Yes.
So I was just making mention of the fact that to add to the mix, of course, we also need taxes to ensure that the economy can be on some solid footing. But you look at the first quarter, and we're falling short by our own projections by about 3 billion, which is the equivalent of about 13.6%. I am asking, what does this mean for us in terms of our debt profile, in terms of our financial stability, projecting towards end of year?
That is where we said that if you look at the Q1 numbers, it doesn't suggest that we are on track the way we should. But of course, if you look at the e-levy with the delay and all of that, but those revenue shortfalls, the pace of expenditure and all of that just tells you that we are not out of date. It may get a little worse if the numbers do not improve. But what it also means is that government is increasingly going to be in arrears with its own transfers, commitments, statutory transfers, and the rest of them. I don't know, perhaps you can find out whether government is up to date with payment to national service personnel, NAPCO, arrears to contractors, and all of that, right? So you can explain some of these things through those channels where arrears will be accumulated. But the government needs to deliver on its obligations across all these value chains to enable the economy to also pick up. That is not happening. Beyond that, you are not seeing any growth enhancing spending. In fact, even if you look at government's own program for a response to the COVID-19, the Batampa Care Program, and the financing arrangement in there to translate it from projection to actual is actually beyond government itself. Because government is going to rely heavily on private sector to provide the much needed financing. The portion that government pledged to provide, has that been provided? Certainly. So those are the issues. You can see all these things scattered all over the place. Thank you.
Let me bring in Seth Tekwe now. There have been numerous engagements on the African continent in recent times, some of them in Ghana, right here in Ghana. And the talk has been that, look, our GDP projection for the year, 5.3%, of course, it's much higher than the African average of 4.1%. Could that be our saving grace? Because the talk of the Ghana Cares Obatampa program and the openings that it brings to Ghana, could that be one of the areas we should really be looking at to get our economy up again by the bootstraps?
Look, let's be realistic. Obatampa is based on loan. You are not able to even raise one. You don't have access to the external markets. We know, and it's not new. Remember last year we said we were going to do 5 billion. We did 3 billion.
Right.
We never went back to the market to do the remaining 2 billion. US dollars, $1 billion US dollars. That was required to support the budget and to do refinancing. This year, we have gone past April when we normally announce and go to Parliament for approvals. And we have not, said we were going to go down from 5 billion to 2 billion. We've not been able, to go to Parliament for approval to go and do the borrowing. The cocoa bond, which normally comes in itself, is also, hanging. So, Obatampa or not, it is dependent on borrowing, and we do not have the access to borrowing. In fact, the government is not able to even raise enough money on the domestic market. That is what the auction shortfalls that is being spoken about. That's what it means. You know, if you can't go to the external market, you have to turn internally to raise, you know, the revenues. The government is not able to raise enough revenue when it goes to the domestic market for treasury bills, for bonds, and the rest. Now, look, I think, you know, it's important. Let me go back to 2 points to what both Professor Bopin and Gachi have mentioned. You know, we have two measures. When your house is on fire, the first thing you see is the flames, and that's your tax to GDP. That's your debt to GDP ratio. That's your tax to GDP ratio. That's your expenditure to GDP ratio. But to tackle the problem itself, that's where you go to a debt sustainability analysis. When we talk about debt sustainability, there is an analysis that is done for Ghana between government, the World Bank, and the IMF. It's about time to disclose it. It has those measures which, you know, the two professors are talking about. It has your expenditure performance. It has your export performance, revenue performance. These are important because for you to go and borrow externally, you must be able to raise enough forex to be able to sustain that external debt, which is where I said that we are having problems. So both in terms of, you know, the signal, the debt to GDP ratio, and in terms of the debt sustainability analysis, you know, when the next one comes, it's not going to be, you know, a pretty story. Now, the problem we have, honestly, is expenditure. What is debt? Debt is your revenue, right? Or your expenditure in excess of your revenue. You've been talking about, you know, the revenue. We projected that we are going to, you know, spend 137 billion, and we are going to raise 100 billion. If you do it on a pro rata basis, the estimates we should be talking about is raising 25 billion per quarter, not 16 billion. Or those conservatives, 25 billion. If you do it just pro rata, yes, the first quarter is normally lower. So we are falling short of the 100 billion. We have not reduced the 137 billion.
But falling short is not an exception. But how bad is the falling short? That is the question. Falling short, your administration has fallen short too. But what makes this difficult, so difficult?
What makes it difficult is that, yes, you are right. Every government, in fact, every developing country government has expenditure above revenue, but you use the borrowing normally to tackle capital infrastructure so that you can grow the economy, so that you can pay that debt on a continuing basis, so that you can put money into your sinking fund, which is foreign exchange. We put dollars into the sinking fund. It wasn't cedis, so that we'll be able, that's how we're able to clear, you know, the bond and the things which I was talking about. So yes, it is about sustainability of the gap. And the point I was making is that the gap is becoming unsustainable. That's the explanation I was trying to give. That you have 137 billion. In fact, if you look at the calculation critically, the expenditure, including arrest, should be 143 billion, right? So you are talking about 43 billion Ghana cedis, or 40% plus in excess of the revenue you want to generate. And you are not raising that revenue. So that tells you that the deficit is going to be wider, and you have to borrow, and you do not have access to borrowing, both external market and the domestic market. Even if we are able to raise on the domestic market, mind you, it means that government is in the domestic market and borrowing heavily, and that means that interest rates are going to go up, and that interest rate is going to affect the private sector, which is how to do its, you know, its bit, and that is because government is taking the credits, you know, away. We mentioned Bank of Ghana, and one is not holding brief for every Bank of Ghana policy. But remember, in fact, I urge you, you know, to let your producers go back, you know, all the way to the MPC reports, to the speeches which the governors, you know, have been giving, you know, in the last 3 years. Please do your research. Bank of Ghana has been warning about the fiscal situation for the last, you know, at least 2.5 years. In fact, the most critical one was a speech delivered by the governor at the Bankers Association late last year. So it is not new. NPC reports have been warning about the fiscal situation. So yes, Bank of Ghana may play its bit. Yes, Bank of Ghana may be seen to be misdiagnosing and whatever. Bank of Ghana may come in with the monetary tools, raising interest rate and the rest. on account of inflation, the debt, the borrowing. But the problem we are facing is a fiscal one, right? And it is up, yes, the problem we are facing is a fiscal one. It is our inability to raise revenue, which is the result of stopping some of the revenue. You know, there was a lot of significant tax measures that were put in place, the creation of GRA,
right,
the measure of VAT service and internal revenue service in order that we can strengthen domestic, you know, mobilization. The Ghana Link project or West Blue project, you know, which we call single window, which today is ICOMS on the import side. There was to be a domestic equivalent, which had not been implemented since 2017. Because when you merge internal revenue service and the VAT service, right, you have to retrain because you have people who for 20 years plus, VAT is over 20 years, have been doing only VAT. And you have people who have been in IRS longer, 30 years, their whole career, you know, 40 years. Those who went in young, they've been doing only income tax. There was a training program. There was an automation program that was to put in place, just like we did on the domestic side. I hear that is now about to be, you know, tendered or is being tendered. This is a 5-year delay. And this is the reason that we are part of the reason why we are not raising enough revenue. Where are the give me, you know, reforms that we implemented? We are told about off budget, putting give me aside, making payments outside, you know, give me and the rest. It means that that is also part of the origin. So we must do reforms. And normally when you do what you call structural adjustment program and the rest, you know, these are the elements that we need. And these are the plans that we need from government. It has been done by past governments. We are not talking about something new. We are not pontificating. We are talking about going back into our experience so that we are able, you know, to do what is needed to take the country out of the situation. Otherwise, we are headed for a default.
Otherwise, we are headed for a default in terms of our debt?
Absolutely, yes. Yeah. And I think that that warning, you know, has already been posted. One is not being alarmist, you know, one is just trying to be realistic as much as possible. Because what is the rationale for saying that? If you are not raising enough revenue to cover your expenditure, and you are not able to borrow, and remember, you know, to reiterate, much of the revenue we are generating is paying only interest, which means that the borrowing that we have to do itself include borrowing to service our debt. So if we are on this path and we are unable to access both domestic and external markets, where are we going to get the money, you know, to repay past debt? And that is what default simply means.
Right, good question. But this is where we'll have to hang it up, Honorable Tekbe, for this conversation. We're very grateful that you joined us with your insights because you've been in the hot seat managing the economy of the country before. But let me keep Professor Gachi and Professor Bokpin briefly on this one. Professor Gachi, so I want us to look at two different angles very quickly. One has to do with, so it's a double header. Rising inflation, and then you also have an exchange rate that is galloping. I'm looking currently at Steve Hank, Johns Hopkins professor of applied economics. And when you look at his rating, his ranking, as of now, between January and now, in terms of currency depreciations, we are in 15th place. We're just in there with, guess what, the Venezuelan Bolivar, which has lost close to 100% of value. The South Sudan dollar, the Sudanese dollar itself. There's the Sri Lankan rupee, which has lost over 50%. And we're calling the Sri Lankan economy a failed economy now. Then you have the Ghanaian cedi, which has lost close to 27% of value. How much has that contributed to where we find ourselves? In which instance, the cedi to the dollar has stabilized, but it's still in some sort of dire straits. How much of it is it contributing to where we find ourselves?
Thank you. I think that is hugely because a component of our debt is pronounced by the level of depreciation. especially because of the foreign component of our debt, or foreign currency denominated level of our debt. So yes, depreciation contributes to the CD term of the total debt of our country, which means it's having toll on debt management. Because one will also say that it brings some improvement in revenue collection in terms of international trade. So international trade, when people import items into the country, the dollar component of the duties and code that they pay, when we convert that into Ghana cedi, it brings the revenue we are raising there up. But the net effect is negative for the country, because depreciation is contributing to inflation one way or the other because of cost. So the pass-through effect of depreciation feeds into the level of inflation we have in the country. And I think one of our colleagues was talking about arrears and co. The twin effect of depreciation and inflation will be that it is possible that government may not be able to undertake its planned programs because of escalating costs of materials and the rest, service costs that are being charged right now because of inflation and depreciation. It is also possible that even few ones that are undertaking, that will be escalating arrears. So this is how you see the effect of these things on our economy. It is not only in terms of the total debt or the debt stock, it is also in terms of the micro level economic activities, and that will have a toll on government finances in terms of building up more arrears and abandoning projects that will not be executed because of escalating costs.
Let's then look at inflation. And again, I'll go to Professor Hank on this bit. It's interesting what he postulates or what he projects, because he is saying that when we project 19.4% and now 23.6%, his projection of our inflation is 41% based on some facts and figures. That takes me back to a conversation I had with Professor Lord Mensa some time back. This is just some weeks ago. And he mentioned that per what he sees, going out on the market and purchasing items, inflation is nothing short of 60%. What is your reading, and how does this also impact what we are seeing?
Well, I think I want to work within the rules. The rule is that SASCA is supposed to compute inflation figures for us, and they demonstrate to us the basket of items they use. Of course, when you take the item on standalone basis, you wonder whether the inflation reflects some of the items. But on average, the institution mandated by the state to deal with inflation matters and report to us for policy making adjustment and for planning is SASCA service. And I believe where we move from at the end of 2021, about 10.1%, and first quarter of 2022, we moved to 23%, 23.6%. Even if we do not accept the figures posted by the source that you mentioned and the other colleagues you mentioned, it is a huge development that has brought aggravated pain, reduction in living standard, increase in cost of living, creating problem for businesses. Contracts are being disallowed because suppliers and contractors have realized that the cost they are going to incur now, as opposed to the time that the contract was handed over to them, is such that they cannot undertake those contracts. Those are realities. So with 40% or without 40%, the reality is dawning on us, and which means that we need to address those things. With 40% or without 40%, the inflation figures have exposed policy weaknesses in agriculture, policy weaknesses in our industrialization, because some of these things would have been taken care of if we have a robust agricultural policy that is minded in terms of contributing to inflation development, contributing to taming the level of exchange rate development, because if you look at it from demand side of foreign currency to import items, which we should have been engaging in the country. So I will stay with statistical service, bearing in mind that
but are you saying then that their formula is watertight, that what they say is the law? Basically, it is a very apt reflection always of the inflationary rate.
No, I think I explained that already. That
no, I just wanted a confirmation. I just wanted a confirmation, so they could get it wrong.
I think those sources you are quoting, we have not put their computation side by side with what the statistical service has done.
Okay.
For which we have credited them to be the best in terms of what they are doing. So I don't think that we should downgrade the work that the statistical service has been doing, but we can use what they have produced to analyze our economy and profile solution.
Professor Gachi, we're grateful for your time. Thank you so much for joining us this morning. Do we still have Professor Bokpin? All right. So this is where we draw the curtains on this conversation. As for talk about our economy, it definitely isn't going to end anytime soon. Between now and 2025, there'll be a whole lot to talk about. We'll be heading into our next conversation shortly, but even as you sit in your office, your home, or wherever you are, we all know water is life. It regulates your body temperature. It keeps you alive and kicking. But what do you go for? Awake is premium purified water treated through a strict purification process to ensure that every bottle of Awake that you purchase on the market refreshes you better. We have the perfect sizes for every occasion. So you're thinking your pocket or your bag, 330 and 500 ml bottles will fit there perfectly. Again, we have 750 ml for the heavy drinkers and 1.5 liters for those who always want a lot more. We have also introduced our special 19-liter jars for offices and homes. You can have them and sip along. Now, you just need to stay awake with Awake Purified Drinking Water wherever you go. So come on, grab a bottle of Awake water and get quality hydration. Awake Purified Drinking Water, one for life. Remember, and here's the good part for me, for every bottle you purchase, an amount is donated to the National Cardiothoracic Center. So you're not just drinking, you're actually contributing to our society. It's produced by Casapreco. For bulk purchases, just call 0262 351 251. 0262 351 251. Up next, we stay with our big stories, and we'll be telling you about, well, soybean smuggling and how that is impacting our economy. Stay.